I want to begin this conversation by acknowledging that the lands on which we are calling on from today are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. I want to pay my respects to First Nations Australians here with us today. An acknowledgement of country is an acknowledgement of the ongoing connection Indigenous Australians have with the land on which we work, live, and play on. It recognises the road paved by First Nations ancestors past and present. As we head towards a historic referendum in less than a month, we have a choice. Do we stick with the status quo or vote yes for practical change? For me, it's an obvious yes. It means a future where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have an opportunity to stay healthy, do well at school, be safe, and lead fulfilling lives. But don't just take it from me. Today, we're joined by a panel of multicultural leaders from across the country. Jason Yat-Sen, member for Strathfield, Professor Peter Yu, Yawuru man and Vice President of the First Nations portfolio of the Australian National University, and Molina Asthana, National President of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association. They're here today to answer some of your questions about the First Nations voice. This is an opportunity for all Australians to join in this important conversation surrounding the upcoming referendum, as well as to learn more about how the voice will impact both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Now we'll begin with some panel questions to start the conversation, followed by a Q&A. If you do have questions you would like to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Finally, to change your language or preference, you can press the More button on the far right of your bottom selection bar, followed by captions. And you can choose from a selection of languages you'd like to change to. I'll give everyone a moment to do that now. Perfect. Now we'll dive in with the first question. Peter, as a member of the First Nations Referendum Working Group, could you tell us about how First Nations Australians arrived at the idea of a voice to Parliament, what it means, and how it stands to benefit all Australians?
Hi, Gavin. First of all, thank you very much for taking the time to organise this webinar. It's such an important and critical time, obviously, in Australian history, and a very critical and rare moment and a national opportunity. Can I also acknowledge my fellow panelists, Molina and also Jason as well, joining me today. It's great to have them being able to respond to the questions and concerns today. So, as you mentioned, I'm a Yawuru man. Just very briefly, my father is Chinese. He's a Hakka man. He came out and worked in the pearling industry in Broome. He was a pearl diver, worked in Broome, and my mother is a traditional owner, a Yawuru woman from Broome. If any of you know Australian history, Broome's quite unique in that sense. During the period of the White Australia days, they had to turn a blind eye to the nature of what was happening in Broome because they needed the Asian labour for the pearling industry. Notwithstanding that, we were very much governed by the nature of the very harsh and apartheid type conditions that existed in this country. And it's interesting, and maybe if there's time to talk about the nature of the other aspects of the Constitution, but I know today we're focusing just on the voice referendum Parliament. So, first of all, it is a very simple idea. I think there's nothing too complicated about this. I think it's very important to understand that we're talking about an Aboriginal voice to Parliament. There shall be a body, as the proposition states in the wording for the Constitution. It may make representation to the Parliament and the executive governments of the Commonwealth on matters that relate and pertain to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But the Parliament itself, subject to the Constitution, have powers to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including its composition, its functions, its powers, and its procedures. So the voice is about saying the best way to make policy and laws about First Nation peoples is with First Nation communities having a say. And I think it's important to acknowledge, and I think most people will be aware, that the current system that we have is not working. and it needs change. And this system has been in place for the last 50 years in public policy administration. I think in terms of how we got here, the specific constitutional recognition really has been on the agenda for over the last 20 years. I think it goes back to 1995 at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission call for better representation. And we have to understand that we've had successive prime ministers involved in those different processes throughout this period of time. I think the main part is the 2015 Referendum Council, and there have been several joint parliamentary committees investigating this. So this has gone. This has happened where the 2015 Referendum Council established a process, which led to the Yawuru Statement from the Heart, and excuse me, and the Albanese government committed to implement that, as people would remember, probably on the night of the election in May 2021. The Prime Minister, on the night of his victory election, announced the government's commitment to implement the Yawuru Statement in full. So I think we need to, if I might actually refer you to, because it has a fairly lengthy history, if I might refer you to the viewers and listeners here to the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which can be found at anu.edu.au, which I think provides a much more comprehensive outline of the historical milestones which have led up to the nature of the proposed referendum. But that takes you to the history of Aboriginal people seeking better representation, advocating for better acknowledgement. So I think we need to look at this from a very thoughtful and fact-based discussion and good faith engagement with the referendum. I think that it's important, and that's why I provided you with that website. I think I might stop there initially, Jason, and then come back to some other questions.
Thank you for sharing that, Peter. And it was insightful to learn a bit more about the history of how we got to the Voice to Parliament referendum, and the fact that this has been an idea which has been around for quite some time, not just this year. The next question that I have is for you, Jason. A concern that I've heard from many multicultural communities is that the voice would result in reparations being paid to First Nations Australians and increased land taxes. As a first-generation migrant from Hong Kong, what are your thoughts on this concern that communities have raised?
Thank you, Gavin. And can I thank and congratulate you for organising this important panel? And can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're beaming in to? May we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And Peter, it's good to see you, and Molina, nice to meet you as well. To this issue of reparations and land taxes, I think unfortunately this is an example of the sort of scaremongering, scare campaigning and misinformation that's circulating out there at the moment. A lot of it is directed to multicultural communities in an effort to scare people and concern people into voting no. The reality is there is no proposition for reparations or land taxes that is part of the Voice referendum. They're completely separate issues. The Prime Minister has said pretty clearly he doesn't support reparations, and I think, as others have pointed out, if the Australian government wanted to make reparations, they could do so now without a voice. That is completely a governmental decision. It's got nothing to do with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice to Parliament. The related argument is that even if the Voice were to make a representation to government that there should be reparations, the government doesn't need to agree to that, which underlies the point that the Voice is merely an advisory body. It has no decision-making power. The decision-making power at the end of the day remains with the government. So even though the voice can make representations, and that is what is at the heart of it, proponents of the voice, we all believe that if you actually consult people, you make better policy and you get better outcomes. That's the purpose of the voice. But ultimately, it's up to the government to make the final decisions. So yeah, look, unfortunately, the stuff about reparations and land taxes, this is part of the scaremongering and misinformation that is circulating in lots of different communities now.
Can I just jump in there very quickly, because I think it's an important point that Jason has made, that in the Mabo decision in 1992, you had the subsequent Native Title Act, and everybody was screaming the sky was going to fall in because their backyards were under threat. It's now over 2 decades, and again, it's come down to there was this question of bucket loads of extinguishment. It's just come down to prove once again, the hype around the misinformation, and the misinformation is not addressing the core fundamental issue here.
Peter's absolutely right. And the same sort of arguments were made when the apology to the stolen generations, when then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made the apology to the stolen generations. People were scaremongering then, saying, oh, that could open the door to reparations. Never happened. It's just scaremongering.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for sharing that. And I think bringing it back to Mabo is a very, I guess, good comparison as well, because as you said, like, we live in a current system where it doesn't really affect non-Indigenous Australians, and you know, it means the world for a lot of First Nations Australians. Molina, I wanted to ask you a question, and this is one of the arguments from the No campaign, and they've argued that the voice introduces discrimination and inequality into the law. Could you explain to us why this actually isn't the case?
Thanks, Gavin, for inviting me to speak, and lovely to meet my other fellow panelists as well. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all joining from, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As Jason said, there is a lot of scaremongering going on in so many different areas and in so many different respects. It's really hard for people, I think, especially with multicultural background, to understand what this is really about. And so I think this is, again, one of those misconceptions, one of those fallacies that is being spread around without any basis whatsoever. There is no law that is being amended or created that will introduce discrimination and inequality. The proposed advisory body wouldn't restrict anyone's rights. The Racial Discrimination Act makes racial discrimination in certain contexts unlawful, which we know. Section 9 allows a person to complain that they've been subject to treatment on the basis of their race that limits their rights. So to breach this section, the voice would need to restrict the human rights or fundamental freedoms of non-Indigenous people. The voice proposal does not limit the human rights of non-Indigenous people, nor does it take away any consultative or advisory access that non-Indigenous people have to the Parliament. In fact, the voice will give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a constitutionally guaranteed right to speak to government and the Parliament about what's needed for practical improvements to people's lives. This in turn would help address disadvantage and systemic discrimination that people have been facing for so many years. So it's a completely false argument, and these are lies that are being spread without any basis whatsoever. There is no law that creates, the voice is definitely not going to introduce discrimination and equality in law.
Thank you for that response. And you're absolutely right, as you just said. You know, like, it absolutely isn't discrimination and inequality for the reasons that you just outlined. Peter, I had a question for you, and some have raised that the National Indigenous Australian Agency has the vision of ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are heard, recognised, and empowered. I did want to ask, how will the voice work differently to the National Indigenous Australians Agency? Did you perhaps have insight into this?
Thanks, Gavin. Do you mind if I just add on to what Molina said, because I think it has a important context because there are race powers in the existing constitution. And of course, those powers have been used against Aboriginal people on at least 2 occasions in the last 30 years. One was, and that is to set aside the Racial Discrimination Act under the race powers, which are called Senate Special Measures. That's section, 5126 of the Constitution. And also, many people don't know, but we still have clause 25 in the Constitution, which is a racist piece of a clause because it allows government to prohibit votes on the basis of race. And that law came in during the negotiation in the Constitutional Convention in 1897, when Henry Parkes, who was seen as the founding father of the Federation of Australia, sought to bring the colonies together to form the Federation of Australia. But many resisted because they had very significant economic patronage from England and other states, and they didn't want to share that wealth. But they were also fearful of the Chinese and other Asian people on the goldfields. So that was the quid pro quo, basically, to bring the states together. And so Australia is founded on a racist constitution. And of course, that constitution is not an act of Australian Parliament, it's an act of the British Parliament, which we have on permanent loan from the House of Lords since 1980. So if you go back to history, the Constitution of Australia is in fact was a British piece of law, even though Australia, during when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, introduced the 1980 Australia Act, which severed the legal connection to Mother England. And now, of course, the High Court is the highest authority. But it's important to know a little bit about the inconsistencies, I suppose, of the arguments of the misinformation that are there. So the 2 times that it's been used discriminately against Aboriginal people might remember the 2006 intervention in the Northern Territory, allowing the government to send in the army and other troops on the basis of dealing with the dysfunction and presumably the kind of targeting and demonising Aboriginal men, particularly in relation to sexual abuse of children. So that was set aside so that the Racial Discrimination Act, so that the government could do that. So you can see that this is not about a race issue because the race power is already in the Constitution as well. But to come back to your question about the National Indigenous Australian Agency, I mean, that's a government agency. It's accountable to government and reports to government. And it's responsible for implementing government policies and programs. This is a critical area because the question of the voice providing advice to the executive is important because of the very convoluted nature of the federation we have, where the Commonwealth government probably provides the most of the investment dollars and funds for Aboriginal wellbeing and benefit and closing the gap, which is a national policy at the moment. But that money is distributed to state treasuries. And so less than about 30 cents to the dollar reaches the ground and has real impact in relation to no businessman or company would survive on that kind of a business model. And here we have the government of Australia providing the states. So it's an issue of the voice providing advice to have greater transparency and accountability, because it's what every Australian wants, is to see the improvement of the position of Aboriginal people. But I think also it is not, the NIAA is not an agency that represents the rights and interests of First Nations people in this country. Does the Department of Veterans Affairs represents the views of all returned servicemen? I mean, does anyone think the RSL is superfluous to the department? I mean, is the National Farmers Federation the same as the Department of Agriculture? Well, it's not. I mean, if you look, so it should point out that, over all of my professional life, I have dealt with several federal agencies that have had sole responsibility for Aboriginal affairs. And I know how clearly there is this huge gap in accountability that exists. So it does not represent, does not speak for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to actually extend off something that you said the fact that not much money actually goes to the ground, and that a business wouldn't survive like that. And I might ask Jason, but I might actually open this question up to everyone. More than 500 company directors have now actually joined forces to support The Voice. These are senior business leaders from big companies such as Telstra and Wesfarmers. Jason, with your extensive background in domestic and international business, could you explain why you think there has been such great support from this group of Australians?
Because it's a compelling proposition. People feel passionately about this. Leaders from around the country feel passionately about this referendum, and they want to do their bit. They're leaders of organisations, so they would like their organisations to do their bit. They feel very strongly, I'm sure, that a yes vote in this referendum reflects the values of modern Australia, and obviously they want their organisations to reflect those values as well. And I think it's terrific that business and other organisations are getting behind The Voice. I think it's great that business leaders are in their own capacities as well, mobilising, organising, and lending their voices to The Voice. Lots of different groups around the community are doing this. We launched the under-18s for The Voice campaign last weekend in Burwood. That's a group of school leaders who they can't vote yet. They're under 18. But even though they can't vote, they still wanted to get involved in the campaign. And they designed an under-18s voice campaign, which is all about young people talking to their parents and their grandparents and their families and their friends. And that's really important in multicultural communities where the parents and the grandparents, their English might not be so good. So it's more difficult for them to get the information and understand what the voice referendum is all about. And so the kids have a really important role to play, to talk to the parents and the grandparents to say, this is what the voice is, and to dispel some of the crazy sort of misinformation that's out there. So I think lots of different groups from around the community are mobilising, as they should, because this is a national referendum. It doesn't happen a lot. The last one was almost 25 years ago when we voted on the Republic. And these are rare and precious opportunities for us to come together as a nation and think about what sort of people are we, and what sort of country do we want to be. And it's absolutely important that people from across the community engage with this and lean into this rather than being disconnected and disengaged.
Can I add to what Jason said? Because I'm a director on a number of boards, and I'm about to sign on to that as well as a director. And some of the organizations that I'm on the board of, we have actually made statements, public statements, supporting The Voice as well. Even though they're membership organizations, as leaders of that organization, we have made statements saying that this is a statement from the board of the company, board of the organization, or from the executive of the organization. And I think it's not just something that we believe in. I think we obviously believe in it, but I think it's a responsibility as well, because having that leadership position comes with a responsibility to make decisions that are reflective of what we believe in and what that support human rights as well. So I'm very passionate about this, and I'm on all the boards that I'm on. I do want everyone to endorse that position. Sometimes we don't get that, but we try our best. And I'm definitely very keen to have put my name in that directors for yes as well.
It's lovely to hear that, Molina. And I guess I wanted to follow up with a question to Peter, kind of on this line as well. And we talk about like money and the implications for this. But I guess there is a point that some have raised. Why are we spending more on a voice? What would you say to that, Peter?
Why are we spending more on The Voice? Money?
Yes.
Because it's an investment. I think a lot in what Jason has said already is investing about a more productive, a more just, a more reasonable, a more equitable Australian and fair society. It's about taking the opportunity to manage in the long term the nature of the current lack of return for investment in the existing structure that exists, as I've already indicated. I mean, what business would still be operating if you're only getting 30 cents out of the dollar return for your investment? And that's purely the case. The question is, why we're investing in it? Because we want to stop the issue of the incarceration and recidivism level. We want to stop the nature of the infant mortality levels. We want to stop and adult mortality levels. We want to stop the nature of the very poor housing that denies people the opportunity to be able to go out and get a job, train up and get a job, to get good education. That's why we're investing. We're investing in this because we want to develop real equitable terms that Aboriginal people can own the risk themselves into the future, because what we have is a disastrous historical colonial kind of shackles of codependency that exist. It appears in the current system it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked, but why haven't we not changed it? So we need to spend this money so that we can guarantee that not only the recognition but the manifest capability that comes with the voice is able to hold governments' accountability, is able to hold states, the Commonwealth and state governments' accountability. It's about ensuring that Aboriginal people have the opportunity to participate in the economy. The demographics quite clearly show, and we mentioned the Title Act, that Aboriginal people now have 60+% interest in the national land assets in Australia, across Northern Australia. That's something like about 90% plus. In terms of the emerging industry, we need to ensure that there is investment in building capability and competency in the Aboriginal community so they can activate those assets for the benefit of all Australians, so that they can get jobs, that they can become business owners. Where is the nature of the decarbonised economy going? Where are they going to find the precious minerals, the critical minerals? Where are they going to look at the wind farms, the solar farms, the conversion to hydrogen? Where's that going to happen? More than likely on Aboriginal land. So we need to build up, we need to invest in building the capability and competency of Aboriginal people so that they own the risk away for all the things that we want to see as Australians in terms of an equitable opportunity and a level playing field for this to happen.
Yeah, and thanks for that answer. So what I'm hearing is that yes, actually will cost less. So yes, will cost less. And on top of that, it will also lead to more practical outcomes than what we're seeing right now. And that's the two things that we really want to see. I had one final question for any of the panelists to answer. If we get advice from Indigenous Australians on every law which impacts them, won't it slow down our lawmaking process?
No, I disagree entirely. I think it'll do the opposite. I think the problem is at the moment is that because there is no engagement or advice, governments make bad decisions for the people that are going to be affected by it, and therefore you have greater risk in regards to litigation. You have greater risk in relation to a conflict and disagreement. I think the ability to engage at the earliest point of opportunity on matters that are affecting, from a local community, because remember we're talking about local and regional voices. We're not just talking about a national voice. I reject the whole question of the Canberra elite disinformation, that what you're doing is you're actually getting opportunity to plan better. So you can get greater efficiency and greater productivity in regards to the matters, because you have to legally, at the moment, Aboriginal people have a right to negotiate on matters that affect them under the native title law. So what a better way to do that, to ensure that there is a direct line of access, a pathway of access to those people who are going to be directly affected, to be able to negotiate and have a negotiated outcome settled on the matters that happen. I think that it provides the opportunity for greater efficiency, both in terms of cost and time, and a greater support for encouraging growth of industries.
Can I add to that? I totally agree with Peter that in any case, whenever the government introduces legislation or legislative reform, they consult with the community and many other experts, including calling of submissions and setting up inquiries. But by consulting people who are actually going to be impacted by a particular law, will make the process quicker, because the government will know exactly who to go to rather than have a lengthy process to ascertain who to consult. So I think it's going to be a much quicker process, in fact. And also the suggestion that the voice would clog up the parliament or government ignores the parliament's ability to determine its own business. So currently the voice does not provide for the mechanism by which that voice will be consulted. So the parliament can make a decision on how it will do that. It might, how it will engage with the
Sorry, Molina, you've just been muted.
I was getting a call in between. Also, the voice empowers, but it does not require the voice to make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the word may has been used. So the parliament can use discretion on when to take advice. It does not prevent the parliament from legislating until it receives representation from the voice, or impose any enforceable obligation upon the parliament to consider representations from the voice, let alone follow such representation. So there's nothing that is going to slow down the lawmaking process.
Jason, would you like to add anything to that?
Look, I think Peter and Molina have answered it sort of well. Maybe the only thing I'd add is the voice will want to be an effective organisation. It will prioritise the things that are most important. And Minister Linda Burney has made clear that, you know, from her perspective, the priorities around health, education, employment. And so rather than trying to boil the ocean and deal with every single issue under the sun, I think the voice will want to be effective, and it will focus on the priorities and the issues where it can have the most impact and have the most benefit to tackling Indigenous disadvantage.
Right. Yep. And that's very well said. And, you know, we've seen the statistics from reports like Closing the Gap. Those are, of course, the first issues which the voice would want to tackle. And hopefully we'll see some outcomes post-referendum when the voice is established. Now, we might move into the Q&A section now of the panel. I see that quite a lot of questions have been asked, so we'll try and get through all of them. I'll begin by a question from Ray. And Ray asks you, Jason, a question. My question is that many Chinese Australians think that they'll vote no, as they did not cause harm to Indigenous people, and they owe nothing to Indigenous people. It is white people who harmed the Indigenous peoples, not the Chinese. How would you encourage the Chinese community to support the voice, given the case?
That's a thanks, Ray. That's a big question. I'd approach it from a number of perspectives. The first is, you know, it's a fairness sort of argument. I won't go into that. I think this is just a matter of, you know, the Indigenous history of Australia, the fact that this land was owned by the traditional owners, by the Indigenous people, until they were dispossessed. And, you know, when you think about the landmass that is now the People's Republic of China, I can think of, in the last 150 years, there are a couple of instances where if things had gone the other way, if history had played out just a little bit differently, you know, during the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, when the People's Republic of China was particularly backward and weak, during the Imperial Japanese invasion of China, and how China was carved up by a whole bunch of foreign powers. Imagine if history turned out differently, and all of a sudden, in the landmass that is now China, Chinese wasn't the main language. It was another language. And the Han Chinese and the traditional ethnicities that make up China now were the minority. And that there was this mass dispossession of the Han Chinese people and the other ethnicities, the traditional ethnicities of China, from the land there. and that there was an opportunity then to make that right, how would Chinese Australians feel about that? And that is, I think, the justice argument. Even if you leave aside the stolen generations, it's interesting. I think a lot of migrants from China, we have a shared history with Indigenous people around racism and discrimination and the struggle for belonging and respect here in Australia. We share that experience and that struggle. But I think most migrants, Chinese migrants or migrants from other places, I don't think we've been torn from our families, by the government of the day. We haven't experienced that, nor do we experience the same degree of disadvantage. Our people don't have life expectancies that are 8 years below that of the general population. Our children aren't more likely to go to jail than they are to go to university. Our young people aren't 4 times more likely to commit suicide. These are distinctive disadvantages that are, it's a distinctive burden that I think Indigenous people in Australia carry. And so that is one, that's the fairness. There's a fairness argument there. There's a justice argument that I alluded to, which is, for everybody here who has faced discrimination and racism and struggles and wants to belong, wants to be completely part of Australia, if Indigenous Australians, if First Nations people can't in these circumstances achieve that justice, then what hope of that is there for migrant Australians? And lastly, I would say this, and I was at a dinner with Stan Grant, a while ago, a dinner at a mutual friend, and we were texting afterwards, and Stan, he referred at the end, he signed off as thank you, my brother. And I think this wasn't just a hey bro kind of my brother. It was my brother. And I thought about that and thought, this was an Indigenous man saying to a second generation Chinese migrant to Australia, we're brothers. And I think for a moment there, the kind of power of when we can all come together as Australians and be united under the 60,000-year history and the meaning of what it means to be Australian, grounded in Indigenous cultures. And I think that will make us stronger and more confident as a country. I think for these reasons together, I think the yes case should be compelling to Asian Australians and to Chinese Australians. And there's Peter's story, Peter's background. There is such a history of close connection between Indigenous peoples and the Chinese people in Australia.
Perhaps, Peter, you'd like to add some words to that?
I think Chinese people did a lot of good. Jason just mentioned my background. There's a very strong unicism and relationship between Chinese and Aboriginal people throughout the history of this country. Yet both Chinese and Aboriginal people shared the same oppressive regimes that were in existence. Not many people know, but the 1948 apartheid regime in South Africa came from Australia and Canada. My parents lived under that. My father, who's Chinese, was not allowed to marry my mother because it was against the law to cohabit with a native. My father told me stories growing up where he had to basically pay money under the table to the police so that he wouldn't be deported. It was my father who told me that this was my mother's country and that the country had been taken from her. My father was very conscious of what was going on. But, you know, at the ending of post-apartheid, Mandela said, you know, we don't want people to feel guilty for what happened. So it's not about guilt. It's not about guilt. But we want you to feel guilty only if you want to perpetuate what's happened. And the other things that I would hope that Chinese people, Chinese Australians today, see themselves as part of the whole Australian community, and therefore seek to have the same aspirations, and as they embrace the kind of broader values of Australia of fairness and equity. And I would hope that most Chinese people would be able to distinguish the fact that they are not being asked to be held accountable for any of this sort of situation. I mean, in fact, we have very strong similarities in terms of the racist history of this country, but we're not dwelling on the nature of the pain of that. We're kind of saying, well, we're uniting for a better cause, a better force for the common good, which is that we need to take this country, as we see ourselves as a social modern democracy, to a new era where there is a greater sense of harmony, greater sense of purpose and reconciliation, because we all believe in a fair go, because we all believe this is what, you know, we all say as Australians. We all talk about fair go and about mateship and all of that, and yet we need to be held accountable in terms of demonstrating the manifestation of those values. But you know, I still live on a reserve. My mother had to apply to become a citizen. That meant she had to become an honorary white. She wasn't allowed to speak her language. She wasn't allowed in town after curfew at 6 o'clock at night, otherwise she'd get arrested. She had to work for a white family, and they basically had complete control of her life and her movement. I used to live on a reserve in Broome, back in Broome, even though I live in Canberra with my job here at the ANU, but I live on an Aboriginal reserve, an ancient tenure of land that was used to keep Aboriginal people out of town after 6 o'clock at night and for other reasons. So it's not a question of what harm has been done by who. It's a question of how can we change this for the better by addressing and unifying for the common good.
And I just wanted to extend this to Molina as well, because there's another question similarly themed, but how do you think we can best target the Desi community to ban behind the yes vote?
Sorry, I can't hear, I didn't hear that very well.
All good. It was, how do you think we can best target the Desi community to ban behind the yes vote? So similar to the question that was asked before.
Yeah, sorry. So I think for me, coming from someone who's born in India, moved here 19 years ago, I share a colonial past as well with the traditional owners of the lands here. My family personally, not so much, but a lot of other families we know, a lot of people we grew up with had families who were marginalized under that colonial rule. So I think if we look at the South Asians, which is the Desi community, as we call them, they share that past. And I think that it should make it much easier for them to relate to the injustices that have been, that the Indigenous people of Australia have been subjected to. And that is something we talk about when we talk about to the Indigenous community, to our Desi community here, that they need to stand up and think about their own ancestors and what they faced, and similar and maybe India is now independent, and other countries in South Asia are as well, but have progressed. But Indigenous people in Australia are still suffering. There's been harm and trauma that has been caused over generations now, and it hasn't ended yet. And they don't have a right of self-determination. So and lack of sovereignty, which we have achieved possibly, and we've seen how it changes things for people. So I think we need to learn to relate that to our own experiences, and also think about it as a human rights issue. There are a number of South Asians who have come out in support. There's groups. In fact, there's a meeting soon after this where a lot of South Asians are collecting to sort of see what more they can do to influence their own community, their groups. The younger generation, as Jason mentioned, will be important, because I think the younger generation hears more about it in school. They learn, they seem to be more aware of these things. My daughter was saying that she's only 14 and was saying, why do we even have why should we be voting about someone else's rights or the right of self-determination. It should be just those people should be talking about. She wants to go a step further. So I think the kids are very aware of this. They're talking about it at home to a lot of their South Asian parents, grandparents, and hopefully that will impact that as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's quite powerful to hear the multicultural perspective. I think that there is a piece about the fact that the voice is an anti-racist measure. And the fact that, you know, like as a member of the Chinese community, like throughout COVID, I think that there's been a kind of reemergence of, I guess, the racism that we had seen quite a long time ago. And so I think that there's certainly a lot of connections that can be drawn between multiculturalism and Indigenous Australians. I'll go on to the next question that I see. There are a lot of questions here, but Isabella asks, how do you think we can reach young people and get them to talk to their parents and grandparents? And I think this is a really important question because of the fact that the statistics show that a lot of the older Australians are actually groups which aren't quite convinced yet on the Voice to Parliament proposal. So how do you think we can actually target those groups and get young people to have conversations and confidently have those conversations with their grandparents and even parents?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here. This is exactly what the Under 18s for the Voice campaign is all about. So there are a bunch of school leaders in my area. It's my youth advisory board. And we were training them on how to be really good community activists. And then we asked them after the training, well, if you guys were to do your own campaign, what would you do? And they all went, we want to do the Voice. So they took the Yes23 materials and they kind of tweaked them a bit. They made them more colorful. They simplified the language a bit, but produced a whole lot of other materials, like conversation guides, scripts for assemblies. There are social media accounts. There's an Insta account, TikTok accounts. There's a website where there's all the resources. There's brochures, there's flyers, there's posters. And this is specifically for that reason. We want to activate young people and have them talk to parents and grandparents about the Voice. And I think it's just such an important opportunity because as I was saying earlier, you don't have a lot of national referendums in Australia. They happen, once every few decades or so. And so if you want to activate the interest of young people in the country, in politics, in political affairs, then these are really precious and rare opportunities to do that. And that's exactly what the Under 18s campaign is meant to do. I'll stick the website, the links in the chat if anybody's interested.
Thanks for sharing that, Jason. Does anyone have any more tips for young people want to engage with their parents or grandparents? I know it's quite confronting because sometimes it seems like, you're talking about politics to people older than you. Peter and Molina, do you have a tidbit of advice that you'd give to a young person on this call today?
I feel that young kids they're fearless. In fact, they don't think so much as we do when we say something. We want to be politically correct, but I think younger people don't necessarily think about politically correct. They think about what is right. So I feel it makes the conversation a little bit easier for them to have with the older generation, and they tend to be quite forthright about it. And like my daughter doesn't have any qualms about saying what should be and how things should be. She tells us, and she tells her grandparents the same thing. So I feel they're quite empowered, the younger generation, more so than us even. So I think they take control of that situation and guide the conversations in the right direction usually.
I can only agree, Gavin. I think there's certainly a lot more intelligent and much more creative in a lot of ways. And I think they probably got their own idea about how they want to do that. But I think, this referendum is going to depend pretty fundamentally on a major part of that demographic of young people. But it's critically important that they are able to invite their parents and grandparents in the conversation, as difficult as it is. I think it's fundamentally about you know, and there's a lot of sarcasm and cynicism and racism, you know, in the world. But I think I like to be I'm a kind of half glass full type of person. I like to be optimistic about thinking. I'm passionate about what this country could be, what it isn't yet. And I think those young people are what we're leaving for them with a yes vote is basically the foundations of a renewed and refreshed Australia. I think that they're reasons for why perhaps the parents and the grandparents have migrated or come to live in Australia for the first reason. It's giving you know, it's an opportunity, I think, by recognising Aboriginal people in this fashion. Also is a benefit for wider ethnic and multicultural communities in terms of their recognition. I think that it goes hand in hand that, you know, the 67 referendum, which is the last time which recognised Aboriginal people, we didn't become citizens, but allowed us to be counted in the national census. You know, there was an overwhelming support of something like 92-95%, if I remember correctly. And some people commentated, if there was such a strong support in that referendum, why shouldn't governments only make laws for the benefit of people, not make laws to the detriment? That's a will or an expression of the voters through the polls in that terms of referendum. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so it has no legal basis to put that proposition. But some people argued after it. Clearly, it was a desire of the Australian public to do something good, to do something of benefit. So governments should make laws for the benefit of people. So I think that this, in some small way, presents a further opportunity to reinforce that.
Thank you for sharing that, Peter. Now, Hawk asks a really good question. Right now, we kind of have a couple of crises going on. I mean, there's the climate crisis, but more relevantly, the cost of living crisis. Families struggling with cost of living look at the Voice as somewhat of a distraction and a hell-bent on a protest vote. I believe a no vote is what Hawk means to say. How can we convince them, given this economic context we're currently in, to vote yes for the Voice?
Maybe I'll jump in here. Never has there been a time when a government is only focused on one issue at a time, right? Yeah, we know that there is a cost of living crisis. Federal and state governments are working really hard on that to try to provide cost of living relief. But at the same time, we still need to run our defence policy. We still need to prosecute our foreign policy. You know, we still need to do all the different things. We still need a police force. We still need to run our schools. We still need to do all the different things that we have to do as a government. It's just not realistic to say, yes, we're confronting a cost of living crisis and we are confronting climate change. Therefore, we won't deal with any other issue that is important. And, you know, when there is this level of disadvantage, when we have a situation when First Nations people, when their life expectancies are 10 years below the general population, that is a pressing crisis that we as a country need to deal with. And we can deal with more than one issue at the same time. In fact, we have to. We have to.
Hawk has actually asked a follow-up question, and Hawk has said that racism is actually front and center of the debate, and that Indigenous people have preferential treatment. Why give them more? I think that this has been touched on previously, but perhaps if either of the panelists would like to respond to this proposition, perhaps I'll just give an opportunity now.
I might give it a go. I think Aboriginal people are given special treatment. We have the highest incarceration level in the world of Indigenous people. We have the highest recidivism levels. We have the highest infant mortality levels. We have diabetes is pandemic in our communities. We occupy the lowest rung of every social wellbeing indicator in the country in terms of mental health and general health conditions. We have 10 to 15 people in some places in overcrowded housing conditions. So yeah, I'd say we get special treatment. So I mean, if anybody'd like to swap with me or any Aboriginal person, I'm sure I can organise it. But I think it is about racism. That is absolutely correct. But I've also mentioned the fact that the Productivity Commission has said previously that for every dollar investment that goes into dealing with Aboriginal welfare and disadvantage, less than 30 cents of the dollar hits the ground for real impact and outcome. Now, that's not my figures or words. That's official words of government's agencies. I was sitting at a dinner late last year next to Ken Henry, who was the previous Secretary of Treasury, and I asked him that question. I said, Ken, what do you think is the kind of rate of return in respect to the government's investment in welfare? And I said, is it about 30 cents in the dollar? And he said, you're being generous in that regard. If you're talking about a qualitative measure in regards to those outcomes. So it is a racist issue because it is something that has, front and center of the process of colonisation and continues to be so. It's systemic within the nature of the way governments and the bureaucracy operates. So yes, it is racism, but I would suggest that I don't know that anybody would necessarily want to swap with any Aboriginal person in the current circumstances.
Thank you for that.
If I can add to that too, to say, the question asked, why are we giving them more? Let's have a look at what we're actually being invited to offer. It is an advisory body that lets Indigenous people have a say in the policies that impact them. That's it. That's it. It's giving Indigenous people a say in policies that impact them. Simple as that.
Yeah, there is no preferential treatment as far as I can see. There is people who are consulted constantly on laws that impact them. In fact, for so many years, Indigenous people have been excluded from that process. So this is a good opportunity to include people who have been excluded for so long, to actually give them a little bit of say in what impacts them. So how can that be preference? How can that be an advantage as compared to what others already have? So it's quite again a baseless kind of argument or conversation that's being had about the preference being given to people of Indigenous background, considering how much they suffer and continue to suffer. We have all the statistics in front of us.
And the numbers aren't biased. This is public information. As Peter referenced, the Productivity Commission has detailed this in report after report after report. And it's been for many, many, many years that this has been the case. So this is just the writing on the wall. I wanted to end with a bit more of a positive question, and we'll wrap up the panel after this. But the question is, how can the multicultural community get involved in this campaign? We now have less than a month left, and this is when most people will be making up their minds. We have CULT communities, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, trying now to engage in the debate in different languages through different lenses. For each of the panelists today, I'd like to ask you, if you could give a couple sentences, how can we engage multicultural Australia as we head towards the first referendum we'll have in 24 years?
Who wants to go first? Jason, looks like you're the one who got in there first. You should go first.
Sorry, I missed some of that.
Whoever wants to go first, I don't mind.
The question was, what can the multicultural community do in supporting the voice?
Yes, in the next
I think
less than a month. Yes.
I think that obviously critically, they need to be engaged in the conversation in the first instance. I think they need to be able to reference the nature of the facts of the matter, not be distracted by the kind of misinformation and disinformation. I think they've got to be able to think about what does a no vote reflect on us as Australians and reflect on the multicultural society as well. Australia says we're a multicultural society. I'm sure there are similar kind of issues dealing with race, ignorance, and prejudice that exist in the various ethnic groups in this country. And you referenced that, Gavin, in your opening remarks about COVID and how it's just sitting underneath the surface. If we don't stand united against the question of the prejudice, the ignorance, and the racism, then it's a matter that we have to continue to deal with. It's a reflection on all of us, no matter where you come from in this country. A lot of people have come to this country for a better life. A lot of people, there are multi-generational kind of descendants of people who've been here for such a long time. They understand the nature of what's been happening. People are not silly. People are very intelligent. They appreciate the fact that if Australia can't treat its First Peoples in a respectful and just manner, how are you expecting them to treat you?
I think Peter put that very, very well. The only thing I'd add to that is dispel the misinformation, right? Raise your voice. When you see the misinformation on social media or in conversations, reject it. Talk about the facts. This is a national referendum. Needs to be decided on the basis of accurate information, not on the basis of lies and scaremongering.
Yeah, I agree with what the other panelists have just said. I think that reflects very accurately what should be done. Personally, I've been doing videos in my own language, but also with other multicultural people talking about it, why it's important for us to vote yes, why we should be supporting this. So I think if we believe that this is the right thing to do, we should go and talk to our friends and family, talk to the external community. If you're a leader in your family, I think you have an obligation to go and talk to the people who you may have some influence over, or the communities that you are part of. Explain to them what it means for them and for Indigenous people. Dispel the fallacies, the misinformation that is being spread around. I would say potentially, I mean, there is a lot of misinformation that is spread on local kind of, or I guess, communication that is used by people of diverse backgrounds. For example, WhatsApp and WeChat and all of those. There's a lot of misinformation always gets spread through that. I think we need to use them as positive vehicles, but to spread the right message as well. As much good messaging as we can, or right messaging we can spread, we can put out, we should be doing that. And as I said before, some of us have colonial past as well. We can relate to those injustices. And so when you speak to someone who has had a similar background, remind them of that and tell them why they need to support the referendum. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And look, with that, we're going to wrap up the panel session today. Now, just a reminder, this video will be uploaded to YouTube, and so everyone who's attending here today can share this link with friends or family in the upcoming couple of weeks. We urge you to also sign up to your local Yes group. So head over to www.yes23.com.au and you can find your local Yes group. If you are under 18, you can of course reach out to the Yes under 18 group, which Jason talked about earlier. And finally, continue to have conversations with friends and family. I might also add one more comment. The deadline to enroll to vote under the AEC rules is tonight at 8 p.m. AEST. So make sure, if you haven't done so already, to enroll to vote, or if you need to change your address if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And with that, I'm going to conclude our webinar.